All right, I'm going to get started. Hopefully everybody's here for the Composer talk. If you're not, please recheck your schedules. You're going to be very confused. So, my name is David Hernandez. I work for FFW Agency. I handle services, development, training, customer training. We do a lot of public training as well. Training on things like this, back-end development, site management, whatever you want. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, feel free to go to our website or contact me. This is my talk for the day, Demystifying Composer, or as I like to call it, David's first run-through. Okay. Little bit of background. I built this tutorial that I pretty much turned into this presentation that you're going to see here today, but there's a lot of detailed information in it that you're not going to get, that you're not going to be able to get in just 1 hour or 45 minutes or whatever it is that we can go through. All right, I built this tutorial earlier this year. You can find it on GitHub. It goes through step by step all the things that I think are going to be really relevant for you. And as a trainer, I built this thing in a way to explain all of the fine details, give you the exact commands to run so that you can test it out. I'm a big proponent of making sure that you actually do things and not just watch videos and read information. You need to physically do it yourself and develop the muscle memory necessary to understand what's going on. All right, so things like these tutorials I find really helpful. Here today, we'll go through some of that information. I'll show you a couple things, but I'm going to keep the demonstration limited, mostly because some of these commands are slow. I don't know that I have reliable internet access, and there's a lot of information to go through. So if you are really interested in this, I recommend that you check out the tutorial. If you're going to do that, you don't even need to stay here. You can go to another session. It's fine. I won't be offended. Or you can stick around, ask some questions, learn some stuff, and we'll be good to go. Okay? So, why Composer? Composer, if you don't know what it is, screen, don't do that to me. It is essentially a dependency manager. If you have done any kind of modern web development, you've experienced this before, it's no different than using NPM or Yarn. If you're working on node projects, if you've done stuff in Ruby and you do gem installs of stuff, it is a dependency manager. It goes and it downloads the things that you tell it to download. But what's the most important part of this is that the dependency manager doesn't just download things for you. It figures out all the correct compatible versions of the things that you need. And that is something that you don't want to have to do on your own. So we'll see how much of this presentation that I can do with hand puppets, maybe, if I can't get this cable to work. Okay. So, getting started. Composer is a command line tool, right? So if I'm on my command line over here, doing things, this is where we're going to use Composer. Okay? It's not a GUI tool or anything else. It is a command line tool. Now, knowing that, what's really important, and I'm going to point out some particular things, so you that are taking notes, there's going to be like 5 or 6 things that I'm really going to point out that you really need to write down. The biggest thing is that Composer is a command line tool. It runs using the version of PHP that is the default on your command line. It does not matter what your web application is and what version of PHP that thing uses. All right, so if I go to my command line here, I tell people this every time, php-v, and it's going to tell you what version you have access there. On my Mac OS, this is the version that's not downloaded, but comes with Mac OS, which is an older version. Right now it's PHP 5.6. That's what's there by default. Same thing with every other operating system. This is a problem. You need to be aware of this, and you need to know how to handle it, right? Because you might be dealing with lots of different PHP applications that you're building, using Composer to build them, and chances are most of them are going to be like PHP 7. Right? And so you might develop or download some sort of Composer setup with scripts and things like that in it, and it does a bunch of weird stuff, and then like, hey, I did it, and I just do Composer install, and it doesn't work. It's like because you're running it in PHP 5, even though you think your web project uses PHP 7 or whatever. That's why you have to go to your command line, do php-v, and see which version you're running. If you're one of those people that does stuff like in Docker, and you've got Docker containers for running your web server, what you want to do is run Composer in the container. And then it will use the version of PHP that is in the container, not the one that's on your command line. Right? So the one in your command line can be inconsistent, depending on whoever's computer is doing the work. Right? All right. Everything that we do is going to end up in this composer.json file. Just like with other things, you've got like package JSON files, and Ruby's got gem files, and all that sort of stuff. Everything we do is going to go into composer.json. That file is essentially a configuration. It is just a big JSON file with a bunch of stuff in it, but it's what tells Composer what to do, okay? That is the most important file for your project, is going to be the JSON file. Then Composer has this lock file. So when we tell Composer to do stuff, it's going to write the lock file, right? And the lock file is the result of the things that Composer does. All right, so you're going to tell Composer to do very simple things, like go install this module. Composer's going to go get it. But what version of the module did it actually get? Where did it get it from? Did it download a dev version of the module? Did it download a stable version of the module? Did that module have other dependencies and it had to go download those dependencies as well and get different versions of them, all that sort of stuff? All that information goes inside the lock file, okay? You do not write the lock file. You do not need to touch the lock file. Right, but it is one of your most useful troubleshooting tools, right? Because all the time we get questions that'll just be, I try to do update, I try to do this, it's not updating the library module, whatever it is we want to call it. Why is it not working? Why am I getting these messages saying you can't download anything, all this sort of stuff? And the first step I always tell people, go look at the lock file, see exactly what's going on, what exact version it has, and what did you expect it to have, right? Because it may not always download the thing that you expect it to download. Right? That's part of the dependency management. It has to figure these things out. Okay? When you download packages, they go into a vendor directory. Right? So you'll see that if you download Drupal 8, as is right now, just go to Drupal.org and download the tarball or zip file or whatever, and you open it up and look inside, you will see there's a vendor folder in there. And inside that vendor folder will be things like Symfony and Guzzle and Twig and all these other things that Drupal actually needs to work, right? So when Composer does anything, it goes and downloads those things and it sticks them in a vendor folder, okay? When you download Drupal 8 from Drupal.org, you didn't have to do any of the Composer stuff because Drupal.org did that for you. And that's one of the things that Drupal.org does when it packages Drupal 8 to be downloaded. So if you actually git clone Drupal 8 and go take a look at it, you will see that there will be no vendor directory inside the Git repo. Okay? The vendor directory gets added when Drupal.org packages Drupal 8. It basically runs the Composer commands, and the vendor directory gets added, and it sticks it there and puts everything inside of it. When you're building your own PHP application, you will see the same thing. You will tell Composer to do something, like install or add a requirement. If the vendor directory is not there, you will see Composer write the vendor directory, and then it will stick all your stuff inside the vendor directory, okay? So ideally, you don't have to actually technically manage that directory. It will do it for you, okay? Everything gets run through the Composer command. So this is what we're going to run, which is essentially, it's a big PHP script, right? You'll get like a PHP binary. It does not come with every operating system. I don't think it comes with any operating system. So if you don't currently have it on your Mac or your Windows or your Linux laptop, whatever, you just have to go to the Composer website and download it and install it. It takes you like 5 seconds, okay? All right, everything you're going to do is going to be Composer space whatever. So Composer space install, Composer space require, Composer space whatever, just like you'd run any other command. Okay? Right? So it can do fancy things like find information. So there are commands. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are commands where you can just tell Composer, go find this thing for me and tell me all the versions available. Like I want to list information. I want to like query its metadata and stuff like that. It has commands for that. It will go over the internet to packages.org and find that information. Okay? Then you can tell it to add dependencies for you. So you don't have to write everything inside the Composer.json file. There are commands to actually add the things in there and change its settings and stuff like that, and it will write it into the file for you. Or you can just write the file yourself, right? And we'll take a look at that file, see how it's structured and the things that are goes inside of it, and I'm going to go over a bunch of different things that are inside there, okay? All right. When you run commands like install, again, it will read the Composer.json file, right? And that's essentially just a big giant array. And so this PHP script that is the Composer command will read in that JSON file and just turn it into a big PHP array, and it just runs and it does its thing based on that information that's in there, right? Almost the like last thing that it does after it does everything is then write the lock file, right? And that's why the lock file is so important, because it's basically I'm done and I'm basically writing almost a log of all the things that we did and put that inside the log file. So you will see that when you run these commands. It'll give you a message, and almost the last thing, sometimes there's a message after that, but almost the last one is writing the log file. Okay? If it fails to do something, it won't write the log file, and it'll roll back what it was doing, make different changes and all that sort of stuff. But when it gets to the point where you see a message that says writing the log file, then you know it's actually done, and it did physically do something. Okay? As I said, it runs using PHP default on your shell, so make sure that you have the correct version that you think you have. You're going to see the commands pretty much written like this, vendor/package. All these things that I'm talking about that get downloaded from Drupal.org are called packages. Right? That's just what Composer calls them. They're PHP libraries, or they're this or that or whatever. Some of them are called projects, some are called this, but essentially in Composer land, they're all packages, okay? So vendor/package just means the vendor is essentially a username that's on packages.org / whatever that particular PHP library that it's going to go download, right? So you'll see things that we go over that'll be like Drupal / something, because Drupal, the organization, has an account on packages.org, and all this stuff is listed under the name Drupal. Symfony has the same thing. We download Symfony. There'll be Symfony / whatever. Symfony / Twig, Symfony / this, whatever. You'll see things with just people's name, just like if you got it from GitHub, it'll be like, David Hernandez / this, if I had an account on packages.org, and libraries that I make would be listed there under my name, right? I don't have one, so don't try. You won't see it there. Okay. First command I'll go over is the init command. This is an optional command, but it's something that you can do to get started. So if you run init in an empty directory, Composer will provide you with a little wizard. And it'll ask you to fill out the wizard. So it'll ask you questions like, what is your name? What is this type of project? What is the description for this project? What is your information, like your name and your email address as the author of this package? Generic stuff like that. You don't have to do the init. You can just write the JSON file, but if you want to just get started, you can say init, and it'll ask you a couple questions, and then it'll write the JSON file for you. Sometimes it's nice to do to get started, just because when it writes that JSON file, it will do it correctly. And one of the biggest problems you can potentially have with JSON files is if you make a typo, it will break, right? It's not particularly forgiving. So if you forget a curly brace in the right place or a comma or whatever, it'll break. So if you at least start with it writing the file for you, then you can just go and edit that file, and you're less likely to be making mistakes. Okay? But it is optional, and you rarely see people actually do it. Right? This is what your JSON file is going to look like. Right? So I ran init, and this is basically a copy of what I have in the tutorial that I was describing. That's on GitHub. You just see things like name, right? And so I put my GitHub username / project, whatever, description, its type is project. I'll go over the type a little later. There's different types, and you can almost make up your own types. Author information, minimum stability I'll go over, and then the requires section, right? And by default, if you don't give it any requirements, it'll leave the require section empty. And the require section is probably the most important part of the JSON file. The require section is where your dependencies go. So when we run commands, there's a command called require that we're going to get to next. We tell Composer, require this package, and that's the thing it goes and downloads. When it does that, it puts a line in this require section. Okay? If you wanted to edit this file yourself, you could edit it and just edit the require section and put the package in there that you wanted to get. And then when you run install, it would just do it based on what information is there. Right? So a lot of the things that we're going to be doing is just editing this require section that's inside that file. All right, install. So this is the command that you need to run to actually build your project and install what is in the JSON file. Right? So when you run Composer install, you run it in the directory where the JSON file is located, and the Composer will get to work doing all the things that you tell it to do. And what you're telling it to do is in the JSON file. Right? So if there's scripts listed in that JSON file to do a bunch of things, if there's dependencies listed in the require section, that's when Composer gets to work and goes and tries to find those dependencies on packages.org, download them, figure out the dependency requirements and the right version numbers and all that kind of work. Right? That gets all done when you just use the install command. Okay? So the install command, you can check out the documentation here, reads the Composer JSON file, it builds the project, It then writes the lock file when it's complete, puts everything inside the vendor directory, which we will discover very quickly in the case of Drupal is bad, right? And then it gathers all the data that it needs to figure out everything it needs to write the dependencies, the correct versions of everything. And this is one of the reasons why Composer is very slow. Right? Composer has major performance problems. And the reason for that is if you watch what it does, it has to go out to packages.org and download all the metadata for everything. And then figure out how to get all the right version numbers to match up. This guy needs this, but this guy needs 2.1, this guy needs 2.2, and da-da-da. So it sits there for 10 minutes trying to figure out all the math for all these different things, downloading more and more data. So you sit there for 10 minutes, and then when it's done, it goes brrr, when it's like knows what it wants to do, and it just goes ahead and do it. So the actual doing part of the Composer script is pretty quick. It's figuring out all the metadata for everything, and that's the part that's slow. If I go back over here to my window, I can show you real quick if you can see that okay. I ran this earlier because I no way whatsoever wanted to do this during a presentation because it'll take 10 minutes. You can see I have a directory with the Composer.json file in it. That's the only thing in that directory was this JSON file. You run Composer install, and then you can see what it does. Loading Composer repositories with package information. My screen sat on that line for a solid 5-6 minutes, okay? Because it has to go and download everything and verify all of this metadata that it has for everything that it's doing. Then when it got to the point where it's like, oh, I'm going to do all these package operations, that part of it took like 60 seconds, right? And so you can see I have a JSON file that's trying to build a Drupal site. So it then goes and installs all these things that it needs, right? Symfony and Zen Framework and Doctrine, and then here it's going and grabbing Drupal stuff, yada, yada, yada. And it'll give you all these messages for all the different things that it's doing. And then right near the end, see what it says, writing the lock file, right? So that's when I know that actually doing something, it writes the lock file, and I can go look inside the lock file to see what it's doing, okay? If I take a look at that log file, for something like a Drupal site, this is all of the information that's in that file. It's everything that I told it to do, right? So you can see this file is over 4,000 lines long. If we look at the actual JSON file that generated this, the JSON file is 40 lines long. Not very big. It only has technically like 3 requirements in it, but then you look at the actual lock file and you can see they had to go download like 70 different things and put them in different places and build out the whole site. That is why the lock file is so important for your troubleshooting. Okay. Now require is the main command that you're going to use to actually now add your dependencies. So you just do composer, require, and then whatever vendor package combo that you're looking for. So written just like this, vendor/package, you can do colon and then the version number after that. I'm going to get into what all the version numbers mean and how that works. All right, but you don't have to do the version number. If you left it blank, what Composer is going to do is just figure out whatever is the most current thing that it can fulfill that requirement. So if I just did it this way, it's going to go download whatever is like the newest version of Drupal 8, whatever that may be, and just figure everything else out. If you need to specify a version for something, then you just do colon and what you want after that. Okay, and I'm going to go over what those version constraints mean. Okay. But literally, this would just be like require Drupal/pathauto, require Drupal/ctools, or whatever, once we get that setup actually working. Okay, and now this is what it looks like. So that exact same file that I had before, I don't know how well you can see this, but now in the require section, Composer actually went and wrote this after I told it to do the requirement, and it put Drupal in there. And it put the version that it went and got. So it actually put the version constraint in there when it wrote the JSON file. That's when I left it blank. So it put in 8.6.x-dev. Okay. Now, you can also do development requirements, right? And so that's a slightly different thing, but it works exactly the same way. So there's 2 sections to the file. One is require, and one is require dev. If you want to add a development dependency, you do the command the exact same way. You just give it an option --dev at the end. That's all you have to do. It's going to handle everything else the exact same way. And when it's done, it's going to write that dependency into the required dev section. Okay. What you need to know about this, and this is like the second really important thing that you write down, is that by default, Composer will install the development requirements. Okay, so you've got a require section, you've got a require dev section. In that dev section, you'd put things like your testing framework and Drupal console and these things you don't need on your production site, right? But by default, Composer assumes that you are in development mode. So if you just do Composer install, it will install everything. If you do not want that, so like you're writing a script that will deploy your site to production server someplace, right? It's part of your build process. What you have to do is just give it this --no-dev option when you do install, and then it will ignore what is in the development section. Okay, and that looks like this. So we have a require section with stuff in it, and then we'll have a require-dev, and here I have Drupal console in it. Right, and so when I require development dependencies, it will install the things that are in there. Okay, you don't need a separate file or anything. It all just goes in the same file. Now, version constraints. This is probably the biggest thing that really confuses everybody. Because you are just getting started. If you go look at these JSON files, you look at the one that's inside of Drupal 8, you go look at the ones that are inside starter projects. You've got a bunch of different numbers. Version constraints, if you go to the documentation page that lists them, it's relatively easy to understand if you just one by one go through them. The thing that really confuses people, I think, is when you find version constraints listed with different number of characters, right? So we're using semantic versioning, so you have 3 digits, right? First, second, third, separated by periods. You will see version constraints listed sometimes with 3, sometimes with 2. And that's what really confuses people. What's the difference between what's going on for one and the other, right? The main thing you need to know is you can do exact numbers. So if you just write the version that you want, that is the version that Composer will download. Okay, so if I put 8.5.1, Composer will download 8.5.1. I'm telling it the exact version I need. If you go to update, Composer will not change this. And that's something that confuses people. So if I had a Drupal install and I'm using 8.5.1 of Drupal, and then an update comes out and everyone's like, 8.5.2 is out now, go update. And then you go, okay, Composer update. And then Composer will say nothing to download. Because you put a specific version in there. It doesn't care that there's a newer version out. You told it exactly what version to use. You would have to modify the file and change it to 8.5.2. And then it'll go ahead and do it. It's going to do what is in the file, okay? So if you have a specific number, that is the only version you are going to get. If that is in conflict with something else, then Composer is going to stop. And that's why you will sometimes see messages like, I can't download this, or could not download a compatible version, something like that. It's because somebody somewhere has a version constraint listed somewhere that Composer cannot satisfy. So that's why you have to do things like look at your lock file and look at the way these numbers are written, okay? So an exact number will be an exact version that you get downloaded. You can use a wildcard, so 8.5.*, and that means Composer will download anything that's 8.5. So 8.5.0, 8.5.1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, 35, whatever. Any version that it finds, whatever's the newest one, it will download and it will use it, okay? As long as it meets all your other requirements. Range kind of works the same way. So you can specify a range and say greater than equals this, less than equals that, whatever, and it'll find a version that's within that range, right? That usually doesn't confuse people that often. Most people don't actually use it, but it works in this.
Half of it, just greater than a certain version?
Yes. In these kind of use case, most people would just use the asterisk and not the range because it's more complicated, like why bother? But if you needed to like limit it to like between 8.5.3 and 8.5.7, but that's always a weird kind of thing anyway, right? Stability constraint, you will see this with development versions. So if you put a dash something at the end of the version you tell it Composer to get, it will understand that as the stability version that you are specifying. So -dev tells Composer it is okay for you to download a development version of this module. So Composer will actually go look for 8.6.x or 8.6 whatever it's called, and if it's an X version, like for Drupal, it will go and download that version, right? You don't have to do -dev. You could be like -rc, -alpha, -beta, like And literally those names, not something you made up, but alpha, beta, RC, dev, okay? Or stable, but stable probably isn't a good use case. Now the two that really confuse people are the tilde and the caret, right? Those are the ones that you're gonna see that get everybody in a tizzy, and most often because people will vary whether they write 2 digits or 3 digits. That's what really confuses people. What you need to know is with the tilde, it will increment the last digit. Okay? So 8.5.0, with the tilde in front of it, it will increment the last one. It will increment the 0. So it'll go get 851, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever. Not the third digit, the last digit. So if I wrote this with 2 numbers and I took out the 0 at the end, tempting fate by trying to type it. Right? If you do it like that, it will do the last digit, right? So it will increment the 5, right? It's always the last one, the rightmost number. That's what it's restricting itself to. And that's what confuses people, because sometimes you see this written with 3 digits, sometimes you see it written with 2, right? And when it's written with 2, it's basically very much the same as the caret, right? So the last one is the caret, which when written as 3 digits will increment the rightmost 2, right? So 850 with a caret in front of it means it will go to 86, and it will go to 87 and 88 and 89, but it won't go to 9. Okay? None of these will increment the first digit. Okay? Because in semantic versioning, the first digit is considered the major version, which is considered a potentially breaking change. Right? So for you to go from like Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is a breaking change. Composer knows that. That's the way semantic versioning works. So it will not try to download the new major version. Okay? You would have to go in and actually change that. Okay. Implementing versions, all you have to do is just write it at the end of the require command or in the file when you write it. So just as I was showing you on that table, you just add it to the command or put it inside the JSON file, and then voila. When you tell it to update, when you tell Composer to install, it'll look at that version number. Okay? So in this case, Drupal console caret 100 means go get 1.0.0, but if there's any newer version than that, that's okay. Download that one too. And because I used a caret, it'll download 1.1, it'll download 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, etc. But it will not download 2.0. So if I run this the way it is, I know console right now is on like 1.8. So it'll download version 1.8 and be good to go. Okay? This is what saves you from having to go in here and like change these version numbers all the time. Right? So if I wrote 1.0.0 with no characters or anything, no constraints on it, it's only going to download 1.0.0. And 6 months from now, when I run update or install or whatever, it's still only going to download 1.0.0. Right? And so people don't want to manage that thing. They want to say, if there's a new version, like a security update or whatever, and I run update, go and get the update. Right? So that's why you need the constraints, because that gives Composer flexibility to figure out what's the newest version, essentially, of this package that I can get away with downloading. Right? So that's why you have to utilize those constraints instead of just putting hard-coded numbers in. Okay? Now, minimum stability is important. You'll see that in the file by default when I first created it. There's a line that said minimum stability. This works with the constraints, and this is what also confuses people. All right? So write this down, that you need to understand how this works. It's not too complicated. It's just saying to Composer, this is the minimum stability version that I will accept. And when it's set to dev, that means I consider it okay for you to download a development version of something, as long as it works within those version constraints that we were just looking at, right? If this is set to something else, like stable, so you can do dev, you can do alpha, beta, RC, or you can do stable. If it's set to stable, Composer will not download a development version of a package, even if you tell it to. It won't do it. So if I told it to go get Drupal console and I know there's a development version out and I put like -dev on it or something, it's not going to do it. It's just said minimum stability, you set to stable, so I'm only going to download stable packages. Okay? So sometimes people don't realize this when they're getting started with Composer. They're using a file they got from someone else, instructions on Drupal.org, which are awful. And they're like, oh, Composer update, and it's like, it's not giving me that version. Why? Sometimes this is why. It's only going to download basically full releases, stable versions of things, if this setting is set to stable in the JSON file. Okay? So you have to pay attention to these things. Composer uses all of the stuff that's in that JSON file to figure out what to do. So all those settings that are in there are going to matter. Okay? So this is how this works. I actually did this. Right? So in my JSON file, I had minimum stability set to dev. I did composer required Drupal. It downloaded 86x-dev because I told Composer the development version is acceptable. And when I told it Composer require, I gave it no version. So it just went and downloaded whatever is the newest thing, and development versions were okay, so that's what it downloaded. Right? On the other side, on the right, I said minimum stability is stable. Ran the exact same command, Composer required Drupal, gave it no version constraint, and what did it download? It downloaded 856, which is the current stable version of Drupal, because minimum stability was set to stable. Okay? So they work together. Yes?
So that minimum stability setting is global for the entire JSON file. It can't be
Yes.
localized.
Okay, now there's another option that goes in the JSON file called prefer stable, which tells Composer even if your stability level is not set to stable, you prefer that it downloads stable packages. Okay, so what Composer is going to do is if I have minimum stability set to dev and I tell it to require something, but I have prefer stable set to true, it's going to look out and it's going to go, okay, there's a bunch of different versions of this thing you told me to get that match your requirements. One of them's a development version, one's a stable version. I'm going to download the stable version. Right? So it's not going to try to do the development version unless you force it to. It's going to by default assume you want the stable one. Right? And it's a good option to have. You can set minimum stability to dev because sometimes you might need a development version of some package. We know that world of like living in Drupal where you have to download dev stuff sometimes just to get it to work. Right? But if you have stable set to true, then it will know, okay, if there's something that is acceptable, I'll do that one instead because you're more likely to want that, especially in a real project that you know is going to go into production, like your website. Right? So do dev when you have to, but don't do it willy-nilly. Okay? Now I'm going to go over some things that are very specific to Drupal, because as I mentioned before, Drupal is awful when it comes to Composer, because it's not built using Composer, and there's things that we need to understand. And why you're actually having all these difficulties has to do with just the way Drupal's built, trying to now be a Composer thing, which it isn't. So if you've been using these starters for projects and things like that, you'll notice that those JSON files are filled with a bunch of different things in them, added information, and it's all to just get Drupal to build a Drupal project the way it should be built and not built like a Composer project. Right? And so I go over all of that stuff in my tutorial, but I want to hit a couple key things in here. Okay? First, the why, because Drupal is already a pre-built product, right? It is not a library that you're just installing as part of your project. It is a thing already on its own, right? It expects its directory structure to be a certain way with the modules folder in a certain spot, and the modules go there. Like, that's not a Composer thing, right? It needs these things to be built properly, right? So number one is adding repositories. All of Drupal stuff is not on packages.org. So out of the box, if you try to tell packages to go get a module like Path Auto, it's not going to do it because Path Auto does not exist on packages.org. The 30,000 modules and themes that exist on Drupal.org are not on packages.org. It doesn't know what you're talking about, right? So it's going to fail out of the box when you try to make this work. But what you can do in your JSON file is Composer, and the Composer.json file has the ability to add repositories. Right? So you can actually add URLs to GitHub projects. So like you've got your own thing that's in GitHub, you can put the URL in there and the name of your package in there, and the Composer will know to go to GitHub to get it instead of packages.org. It's the same thing with things that come from Drupal. All right, so we do it like this. And I encourage you to go like look at my tutorial, but also the starter kits and things that you use, these things are all in there. So you don't have to memorize it just from my screen. You know, you want to copy and paste stuff. Right, so what we do is we add a repository section, and then we provide the URL, which exists, packages.drupal.org. This is a Composer facade that exists on Drupal.org. Basically, Drupal.org has a server that knows how to act like it's packages.org. And that's what it does with all the modules that are on there. It treats them like vendor/package, whatever. Drupal.org is the one that's actually doing this work for you. So once you add this in here, and then you tell Composer to do something like Composer required Drupal/path auto, it now knows to go to Drupal.org and actually get path auto from there instead of trying to get it from packages.org. Okay. The second are scripts. All right, Composer has the ability to script itself, so you're not just installing the things that are in there. There's a script section you can add, and you can provide scripts and tell Composer to run these scripts. And we need this because the scripts are what we're going to use to actually build a Drupal project the right way and like put things in the right directories and all that. Right? You can't do this without scripts that make the work happen. Okay? Now, Composer has a whole bunch of events that it will recognize, like pre-install, post-install, pre-update, post-update. There's a whole bunch of them. And some people that make things will make their own plugins that have like their own Composer events that it can trigger and all that kind of stuff, right? So the main thing that you're going to do is you'll find this project, Drupal Composer, Drupal Scaffold, right? And this is the thing that will actually scaffold a Drupal project for you. It has a script in there that understands. Don't take Drupal and stick it in the vendor directory. It understands you now want to make like a doc root or a web root or whatever you want to call it. Put Drupal in that and put the modules folder in that. And when you download Path Auto, it goes in that modules folder. It doesn't go in the vendor directory. All that kind of stuff, right? This Scaffold project has the scripts that know how to do that. The good news is part of the Composer initiative that people are working on for Drupal is to do things like take these Scaffold scripts and actually make them part of Drupal 8 so that people don't have to build out these complex Composer.json files and include these other packages with all these scripts to do all these things. We're going to start making Drupal do these things itself, right? And this is what it looks like, right? So I have a require section, and then you can just add a script section, and we're really just adding the path and the namespace that goes to this static method that is the thing that is the script that runs, and it knows how to make the doc root and stick things in all the right places, right? You don't need to memorize this. You don't need to write it down. Any JSON file that you find on Drupal.org or anywhere else is going to have this already in it. You just copy and paste it, okay? So I'm going over some of this quickly because a lot of this is not stuff that you need to write down when you go actually look at these files that are already listed online, including ones that are recommended from Drupal.org. The stuff is already in it. So I just want to explain the stuff that is in that file. You don't have to write it all down here. Okay? And this thing is the main thing that stops Drupal from sticking itself inside the vendor directory, which is why none of this is going to work. Okay? And then there's an extra section. So you can add an extra section to your JSON file, and then that's where you put all the information, metadata, essentially information, that any of these packages might need. And the scaffold needs some metadata, right? And that metadata is going to mostly look like this. So you get this extra section with installer paths in it. And those installer paths would tell the scaffold script where to put things, right? So in this case, I have, if you find a thing called Drupal core, put it in docroot/core. If you find a thing that is a Drupal library, put it in docroot/library/name of the thing you downloaded. If you find a module, put it in docroot/modules/contrib/whatever the name of the module is. This is how Composer then knows how to put things in the right place because the scaffold script is what does it, right? If you want to, you can modify this information. It's just metadata. So if you don't want your directory to be called docroot, then you just change that and call it something else. Call it web, call it webroot, call it /HTML, call it whatever it is you want. You are telling Composer and the scaffold script where to put things. So write the correct path that you wanted here, and it's fine. It'll work. Okay. Right. But again, any of those JSON files you might have downloaded as recommendations for how to build a Composer project have this extra information in there. You can just modify it. Okay. Next is an important thing. This is another thing that you need to write down. There is a difference between this thing that you can get from packages.org that's called Drupal/Drupal and this thing that is called Drupal/core. Okay? Really, the recommendation is now that you're doing all this composery stuff, you don't want to use Drupal/Drupal. You want to use Drupal/core. And the scaffold script wants Drupal/core. If you go look at them, the difference between them is Drupal/Drupal is Drupal 8. You go look at it, and it's just Drupal 8. It's the core directory, the modules folder, the index.php file, the robots file. It's the doc root, right? But core isn't. Core is just the folder. It's the core folder. And that's what the scaffolder wants, because the scaffolder is actually extracting that core folder and then putting it where you told it to. Right? So in this extra information here, where it's doc root/core, that's the thing it finds called core, and then you're telling it where to put core, which is in the doc root. And then the scaffolder actually does all the other stuff. It'll write the modules folder, it'll put index.php in there. It like builds your whole project out the way it needs to be built like a Drupal site. Okay? So the recommendation is, moving forward, use Drupal/core. Drupal/Drupal might even go away. It might actually get deleted. Okay? Because it doesn't make sense. You're telling Composer, go download this entire thing that is Drupal. You're basically telling it to download the doc root, right? And it doesn't want to do that. It wants to do other things because it wants to modify the autoloader, and you can have the scripts do things like go into the sites directory and add the settings.php file and write all these other things. So it really just wants an unmodified core folder, and then it can build everything else out. Okay? So don't use the other one. All right? Other stuff. So updating. Updating is actually really easy, right? You just say Composer update, and that's it. Or you can say Composer update and then give it the package, just like when you install them. That's all you got to do. The problem people get into is they do this and they're like, it didn't work. Well, it didn't work not because the command failed, but probably because of something like a version constraint that you didn't have set up correctly or that you didn't expect, right? So people say all the time, like, oh, a new version of Drupal 8 came out, like 8.5.6 is out now. I go run Composer update, it doesn't download it. Like, why? Like, look at your lock file and look at your JSON file. It's not Composer's fault. Composer didn't fail. Composer will give you messages. It'll say things like nothing to download or could not download a compatible version, things like that. I'll tell you, the update command is basically just doing the same thing the install command does. So if nothing out in the internet has changed, then Composer is not going to do anything any different. Okay? You can tell it to modify just one specific thing, but of course it is still going to go through all the dependencies of that thing and figure them out, right? So that may end up being more than you had anticipated. You can also do more than one package, so you just list them in the same command, and it'll do just those two. Yes?
Are you going to touch on with dependencies and with all dependencies option or parameter?
I don't have a slide for that. I'll probably run out of time, but I think I do have some of that in my tutorial. All right. Now, for a Drupal site, patches are important. This is not something that Composer does by default, but there is this project called Composer Patches. If you require that project, it'll come up with scripts that will actually apply patches for you. So what you can do for a Drupal site is do this, and then in the extra section is you put this patches section in there, and then all you have to do is list your modules and give it the path to find where the patch file is, and Composer will actually apply the patches for you. So if you're thinking about like building a project, like you have a build process, right? You put the information in the JSON file to apply the patches, and when someone runs Composer install, it will apply the patch, right? So this patch can be a URL, like in this case, a URL to a patch file that's on Drupal.org, like you found on an issue someplace. The patch file could be local to the project, and you could just give it a local path. You could put like .. / whatever to the file, or like /var /www, whatever you want. It'll go find it locally if you provide the patch file, or in this case, it'll go to the internet. But of course, just like everything else, if you're depending on the internet, then just know that if you have issues, if that file goes away, whatever, you can have problems. Okay. Okay. And now last, the create project command. So you've probably seen this if you've gone to the Composer documentation on Drupal.org. This horrible, horrible documentation that's meant for people doing this for the first time. Do you want option A or option B or option C? Who writes documentation like that? Well, a number of these, particularly option A, will eventually, once you get through this massive information, will tell you to do something like run this command, Composer create project, URL, blah, 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 blah. Okay? What the create project command does, essentially, is you're pointing it at another project. Right? So say like I built a Drupal site and I provide my directory JSON file or whatever, and it's already set up in a certain way, and it's like on GitHub or whatever, it's on packages.org, the create project command will go to that package and essentially do a git clone of it. So you will get the folder, you will get all the stuff in it, you will get the Composer JSON file that's in it, and then it will run Composer install. Right? So that's why for a lot of people, this documentation on Drupal.org was written and why this project exists. So somebody made this project as something that you could essentially copy. Right? So people are trying to figure out how to like do all this Composer stuff. And you can write a Composer JSON file yourself, like I've been describing with all the stuff that I'm describing for you now, with the extra information and the scaffold or the scripts and all that. You could figure out how to do all those different things. Well, somebody has a GitHub repo with this stuff already built into it, in a JSON file with some additional folders and some scripts and stuff in there. You could just copy it. So you either go to GitHub, find that thing, and like clone it or download it onto your computer, and then run Composer install. Or Composer has a built-in command that just says, "Tell me where that thing is, and I will go get it and do that for you." Right? And that's what the create project command is. Okay? So it just looks like this. This is a copy of the one that they recommend for you to run. This comes from Drupal-composer/Drupal project. It's just Composer, create project, the name of the package, which is this one, Drupal Composer Drupal project. We're supplying a version number here, which is just go get 8.x-dev, right? So like go get the most recent version. They don't like tag versions and stuff like that. And then after it, I have a period, right? This dot here. But this works exactly like git clone does, right? So git clone, you do git clone, you give the URL to the GitHub repo, and then what do you put after that? You put either a dot, which says clone that in this current directory, or you give it the name of a directory. And then it will go and create that directory and put the Git repo inside of it. Create project is doing the exact same thing. It works just like git clones, doing the exact same thing, right? And so what you need to know is that this has to go into an empty directory. Right? So you can't run this inside of a directory that already has a bunch of stuff in it. That's not going to work. You have to put it in a new directory or go run the command inside a directory that's empty. Okay? Then what we have are two options here. One is stability-dev, which is just like I described before. You can write minimum stability into the JSON file, or you can provide an option when you run the command. That's -- set the stability, right? -- stability. Provide the stability label, which is dev. Right, and so that's what it's going to do. It's going to go ahead and download a development version of this project. Right, and then no interaction. It just means don't ask me any questions. Right, that's a command line thing. It's just going to assume yes for everything and just go ahead and do that. So if you run this command, what it's basically going to do is clone this repo here into a new directory and then just run Composer install on it. Right, does it all in one fell swoop.
Does it actually put the .git folder from that project, or it's going to leave that out?
No, I'm pretty sure it leaves that out.
It puts it in unless you...
It does it?
No, with dev versions it puts it in. And then...
Oh, right, because we set the dev.
I can't get it to commit right, and you have to remember to remove it before you commit, or else it doesn't actually commit stuff.
Right, I forgot to mention that. Usually when you download dev versions, and there's a couple different options and different ways to do this. Composer has the ability to not just download the package, but actually will clone the repo. And you will see this actually in the lock file. So there's a difference between like source and distribution versions of the things that it downloads. If it downloads a distribution version, it means it just went and got like a zip file from like GitHub. Or if you tell it to download the source version, it means it goes and it clones the Git repo. Right? And so you'll have all the things that are left over from the Git repo in there. Okay?
You have to remove that Git directory, or else it doesn't commit the way that you probably want it to.
If you are then going to turn this into your own project, yes. So that's why like you don't want to do that. You don't want that .git folder in there because then you want to commit this into your own repo, hopefully, and manage your project that way. Okay. So things to remember: Composer will not install modules for you. So if you tell it to go get Path Auto, this is not Drush. It will not install it. It just goes and gets it. It sticks in the folder. You still have to use Drush or go log into the user interface and tell it to install a module. Composer does not care about your Drupal site. It's just downloading stuff.
Even the Composer install command. Do not be tricked.
No.
That's not what that
Composer knows nothing about Drupal. Does not care. Okay. Be mindful of the lock file. Right. It will show you everything. It will show you where it got the thing you told it to download. It will show you what version it downloaded. It will provide all that metadata we've described for all these other packages. It basically goes to that package and grabs the stuff that's in its own composer.json file and puts it in your lock file. So you will know like who the author is. You will know what its requirements are. All those different metadata that comes from these things will be in the lock file. So use it as your main troubleshooting source. My recommendation for people is think ahead about how you're going to manage Composer in a project as a team, because that really is the biggest problem that I see in development environments with different teams that are working on projects that are managing Composer, because you'll do things like people will say just commit the Composer.json file and not the vendor directory. So that every developer on their own just checks out the repo and just runs Composer install and all that sort of stuff. But then one developer is working on a feature branch and they need to update something, so then they update the JSON file, then somebody else hasn't done it, and then you get this big mess of different things of who's doing what, right? It gets really confusing. My recommendation is if you're in a team environment, is make sure that whoever's managing the team, so like your team lead or your architect or whoever that person is the one that is managing all the Composer-related things. Okay? Have one person keeping track of all these things, otherwise you're going to make a mess. And I do not, despite what other people say, I do not have a problem with committing the vendor directory. All right? It is the easiest way to manage a project. The excuses people have for not doing that, I think, are often illegitimate. They do not compel me at all. People say things like, now your Git repo is smaller. Ooh. Right? It will solve so many problems if you just commit the vendor directory. Then you can give the project to like your front-end developer who's not going to give a shit about Composer. Right? And the vendor directory will be there and it will work. Right? Let the team lead manage what's in there. Or at the very least, have a build branch where the vendor directory is committed. And you don't want your production server running the Composer install commands. Because your production servers you're going to try to build, you're going to have an in-between build server that builds it, waits 15 minutes for Composer to do something, discover you have a DNS problem or something went wrong, and it didn't download the packages, and now the builds fail, and you're like, what's going on? You're like, Jesus, I just wanted to download some software and put it on the dev server. What's going on? It's like, just do it locally, commit it, and then just push what you know works. It's fine. All this, don't put the vendor directory, no. You're going to save 10 megs in your repo. Whatever. Read the messages. Composer will tell you what's wrong. I don't know why people don't read these messages. It will tell you literally, couldn't download something, could not find a version that matches your requirements. It's going to tell you what is wrong. If there's something like an internet problem and it fails, it will tell you. The biggest thing I will say, though, is if you get messages that are really weird and it just completely bombs and you don't understand what is going on, you probably have memory problems. Composer is a memory hog. If it absolutely fails, then my guess is it is running out of memory. Right? And so that is a concern when people have limitations for the amount of PHP memory they allow on their command line. So if you're limiting that, you can very easily hit that limit. For these Drupal sites with all the different packages that it's trying to download and install, the amount of metadata that it downloads can be something like 600 or 700 megabytes of stuff, of metadata that it needs just to figure out all those version differences. And that is a lot of metadata, right? So it will run out of memory. If you run it in a Docker container, you're like, my web server's tiny, I don't need to do much. And then you run the Composer commands in it and it only had 500 megs of memory or something, it's going to fail. So if you get really weird, wonky errors, I would look for that first. Okay? And then, main thing is it'll be slow. So we kind of hit our end, and we're supposed to get the heck out of here, but I had technical difficulties, so you have questions?
What about deleting old dependencies? Does, let's say C-Tools had all these requirements for dependencies, and then it changes and it no longer has the same requirements, so it got rid of one of the dependencies that it needed. Will Composer get rid of that?
Yeah, Composer will update everything that's in the vendor directory, and that also includes when versions change. So if you downgrade a version, it will do the same thing. So it will get rid of all the older versions that no longer meet those requirements and replace them with the newer ones.
So it does actually delete files from disk?
Yeah, it'll delete stuff from your vendor directory.
Is there an easy way to convert a non-Composer project to use Composer?
No. For Drupal, somebody was working on a project to script that. But the thing is, it's actually not that hard. if you just go through the things that I explained here, you will see what you have to do, right? And it's largely things like just get Drupal into the Docker root, and you're going to have to move the vendor directory probably outside the Docker root because this is where we really want the vendor directory to be, stuff like that. I mean, you can also, if you're managing an actual Drupal site this way, you can do what we've done here, or use one of these starting points, build out like an empty Drupal 8 site, and then just replace the parts that you need with your parts, and that will be fine. So if you have 8.5.4, and you tell Composer to build out an 8.5.4 Drupal 8, and then just put your modules into the modules directory and your themes and your site info, everything else is just the code that it goes get. The stuff that's in the vendor directory is just like Symfony and Guzzle and all that kind of stuff, right? So it should technically actually work, and I've done it that way, and it's fine. You just have to know the right things to go put in the right places, and that's the part that some people didn't know.
So we're looking at hosting some of our own packages, like modules and themes, in-house in our SVN repository. So and we were thinking about, like, can we version those and that sort of thing, and have Composer then pull those from our in-house repository?
Yeah.
Is that something you're familiar with? Is that
Yeah, you can do that. That's how a lot of people even manage their projects, is that they will take their site and in their, like, you could manage a Drupal site with just a Composer.json file and not put any of your custom code in it, but put your custom code in another repo, and the JSON file just tells it where that repo is, and it knows to go get that stuff and download it when you do the install.
How does Composer know what versions are where of your modules?
So it's the same. When you add the repositories, right, you in there are telling it where this thing exists. So you do the same thing, like if you provided a GitHub URL, right, you have the URL to that project, right, and so you provide, and so when you say I require the 8.2 version of that, it's going to look at that GitHub URL and use GitHub's API, and it can see all the branches and the versions that exist in that repo, and then that's what it's going to pull.
Okay, cool.
And you do that essentially if you're working on like development versions of things. So like you're building a site, and then like one of the modules is something that people are working on and it's someplace else. You can tell Composer that that's like a development thing that exists somewhere. It will, when you tell it to dev version, it will clone the repo, and then you can work on it, you can commit, you can push your stuff and all that kind of stuff, but it knows to go clone the repo for that particular module or whatever you're working on.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sorry for technical difficulties. Like I said, if you really want this exact same stuff, go look at the tutorial that I have on GitHub. It's each one of these steps that you can go through and actually type all the commands and see the results of what it does. I have README files in all of these that explain everything and even tell you like why things don't work. Right?